All right, so I am here saying hello to my friend John, who is the founder of Workbrew. John, super awesome to see you here. Thank you for being on one of the very early episodes of the Risotto Podcast. We're trying to get out there in the community, have exciting and interesting conversations about IT. And you are somebody that I always feel like I walk away having learned something new, just given how long you've been in tech, you've been in IT. Just some really awesome highlights from your background that I remember. You've worked at a lot of really awesome companies, like you worked at GitHub, you worked at Twilio, you worked at Microsoft, kind of a lot of big names on your resume. But correct me if I'm wrong, but the last several years for you have been living and breathing Workbrew as the founder of Workbrew, and we're going to get all into that. But first of all, just welcome. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I see you guys all the time at all the same events. It's great to be, able to have a chat and, share this with everyone.
That's right. That's right. We were neighbors at the Mac Admins event in Penn State just a few months ago. That was super fun. I will never forget how we kind of came up with that idea to give out ice cream from the Berkey Creamery, which is like, if you haven't been to Penn State and you do go, I highly recommend this place. But yeah, that was super fun. And I'll never forget that picture of us handing out ice cream to all of the people at the Mac Admins event. That was super fun.
Yeah, a lot of fun there.
And you kind of just, it's kind of diving right into it. You kind of have this belief in the power of community, if I'm not mistaken, and kind of fun and interesting events like that, like ice cream giveaways. And I'm curious, maybe as we can kind of dive in, I'd love to learn a bit more about your background, how you got started with Workbrew, and kind of your roots in community. Maybe you can kind of walk me through, like, how is community building important to you, and what were you doing before Workbrew?
So I got my start kind of in the startup space by accident. I was always very interested in software and programming. And one of the very early things that I did is I went to a conference. It was DrupalCon Boston, which Drupal is like a web CMS from the early days where you could build like interactive websites with a database without really needing to code all that much. It was open source. You could contribute to it, build modules and things. And that was my first kind of developer community event. And when I went there, I saw people on stage and I thought to myself, what makes them different? Why are they on stage and, I'm here in the audience? And at first I had this impression that these people were very special and that they were, somehow different. But really, I mean, they're obviously all very intelligent and they work very hard, but they're no different than, you or me or any listener of this podcast. It's just that they took the effort to, prepare themselves and get up in front of the room and start talking. And so this was like a really important insight for me early in my career. I mean, I was still in college when this happened. And it led me down this path of, not just being a software engineer, but using the mix of people and the application of software, and then also being a software engineer to bring those pieces together and start, a career. And so what ended up happening is I had lots of different opportunities where I wanted to learn. And the things that I wanted to learn involved getting together with experts in the field. And I didn't really have the access to those people that I wanted. So I ended up creating events and running meetups and, blogging about technical topics, twice a week, and just doing everything that I could that was kind of just repetitive and muscle building activities, to the point that I was the one kind of creating the atmosphere of people who were all much smarter than me getting together in one place. The first time that I spoke at a conference was actually a conference that I organized. And the reason for that was I applied to other conferences and got rejected. So I said, I'll just run my own conference and I get to pick the speakers and I will be one of them. And so what happened was, I started to learn that there's really a lot of value in doing something that's not that hard. You need to be organized. You need to talk to the right people. You need to be convincing. You need to be passionate. But you can create community and bring lots of great minds together and everybody benefits. Another thing that kind of happened during this transition for me was that I was very shy in those early days. And out of necessity, I became a more outgoing person. Maybe it's a stereotypical thing of like a software engineer to be shy, hiding behind the screen and whatnot. But it really helped my career to do that. And ultimately, I got my big break in the startup industry by applying for a job that I had never heard of called developer evangelist. And so I was living in New York City. I was working as a software engineer at a small company. And I saw this job posting for a company named Twilio. And they said, developer evangelist, somebody who knows how to write code, loves to talk about code, and can be a great educator. And so I said, that sounds kind of like me. And I applied. And sure enough, it was a great fit. And really, that was the spark that started it all for me, building out software skills and also communication skills around technical topics to use education as a tool for, advancing a business objective or marketing or whatever you want to call it. But really what happened was I was doing something I really loved. And then I found out that there was a job associated with it. And that got me right into, one of the hottest startups of the time, Twilio, which became, a public company and was very, very successful. And I got to join them when nobody knew who they were. It was a dozen people when I joined.
That's awesome. And about what time frame was that? Like if you were not to date yourself, but this was probably 10 years ago or something?
I think it was 2010.
Okay. Yeah. So in that time frame,
maybe 2009, 2010, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you were a software engineer, so coding a lot, but you craved community. And what I'm sensing is that you found this connection between this virtuous cycle of teaching and learning. And I've also kind of gravitated toward this myself because I've found that you never know a topic so well as when you're forced to teach it to others.
Of course.
I'm sensing that's where you're kind of also going, as you were also getting, not only were you helping share knowledge, but correct me if I'm wrong, you were also benefiting from this.
Oh, absolutely.
Yourself to get into the spotlight.
I was the biggest beneficiary of anyone. Of course.
So you went to Twilio, you became a developer evangelist, and how did you continue to hone your skills, and how did you go from there to where did you go after that? Was it GitHub?
So I had a number of jobs in between. I basically spent a little bit over a year at Twilio doing developer relations. I learned about software, but really what happened at Twilio for me was I readjusted my goals from being a software engineer to being, a developer go-to-market person, right? Being a developer evangelist, my job was to get people hyped up about really interesting software tools, which is, second nature for me. I love getting excited about cool software. And, at that time, it wasn't so obvious that was a valuable skill, but it turns out that it's a very valuable skill in the startup space. And so after I left Twilio, I worked on a passion project for a while with my now co-founder, Vanessa, called Peer-to-Peer University, which is an online education nonprofit where you can work together with other people on open courseware. So at the time that this was happening, originally, this was around the launch of MIT's open courseware. It was the beginning of all of those MOOCs. This predated the MOOCs, the massive online courses.
Yeah.
So we did that for a while as a nonprofit. And then after that, I joined GitHub. And when I joined GitHub, again, I applied for this job that I had no idea existed. It was called Education Liaison. And it was basically, come be the education person for GitHub. What that means, we have no idea. You can figure it out when you get here. And I saw that and I was like, that is just exactly the thing that I want to be doing. And I applied. Nobody responded for a couple of months. I nagged some people. Eventually, I got them to fly me out to San Francisco for an interview. And I got the job in 2012. I joined GitHub. It was around 100 employees. And this is where I want to take a brief pause to think about, what it is that makes someone, valuable from a skills perspective. And something that I really believe in is that the more diversity of skills you have, the more unique you are. So it's one thing to say I'm a great software developer. It's another thing to say I'm an expert in the education space and I'm a great software developer. It's another thing to say I know how to do community, I know how to do marketing, I'm also a software developer and I have a ton of experience working in the education space. And so what ended up happening here is, there are a lot fewer jobs that match my exact skill set. So the market for my job prospects at that time was smaller, but the match between me and the role was so high. So I joined GitHub. I started GitHub Education. We launched several products there, including the GitHub Student Developer Pack, which is a tool for software developers in school to get access to every developer tool they can for free. That was very successful, got millions of users. We launched a learning management system so you could teach people how to code on GitHub and a bunch of other stuff. And then I met a lot of really great people while I was there. That's kind of where I built my network in the developer tools space. And then following that, that's when I started working as an entrepreneur, right? I left GitHub after the acquisition by Microsoft. I wanted to do my own thing, and I started, kind of fiddling around.
So, okay, I'm going to pause you there because that's where I want to go next. But before we get to the origin of Workbrew, when did you know that you wanted to be an entrepreneur? Like, was it always something you had in mind? Was this a North Star for you? Did you know that developer evangelism and marketing was your path? Or did this idea kind of start to build as you were doing these things?
So I've always wanted to be an entrepreneur. I've had businesses my entire life. I can remember as early as, second grade selling ice cream out of my bedroom window as people were walking home from school. Every day I would run home from school early so I could beat the crowd and then, sell ice cream and snacks out of the window because I was on the path, walking home. I also had a lawn mowing business when I was a kid. I also, had an IT business. I did websites. I did web hosting. Predating my time at Twilio, I actually had a voice over IP service that I ran. So I've always been an entrepreneur. But when you say, like, did you always know it was going to be marketing? I never would have guessed it would have been marketing, right? Like I had no idea that I would end up in marketing. And really, I was very fortunate to find that role at Twilio because it taught me a lot about the value of getting your message out there. There are a lot of developers or maybe even startup founders who are more technical that think if you build it, they will come. And you have to be really lucky for that to be the case. You have to get out there and tell people about what you're doing, make it interesting to them. And so, I picked up the marketing angle along the way, and it's really served me well, as we've, started our own business and things like that, to be able to go out and generate interest for the product that we've built.
Yeah. Yeah. And that goes back to, you talked about the rare mix of skills being really useful and all of that. So that makes sense. Okay. So you always wanted to be an entrepreneur. You didn't necessarily have like the big idea. You've been trying some things. How and when did you get the idea for Workbrew, and how did you know that this was going to be the big idea that you're going to devote years of your professional career to?
So the original idea for Workbrew was actually probably back in 2013. I've always been a Homebrew user, and I'm very passionate about, my dot files and configuring my machine and making sure everything is nice and clean. If I get a new laptop, it's up and running right away with all of my things exactly how I like them. And my version of the idea for Workbrew back then was, Homebrew is a really cool project in the open source space. Lots of people use it. Somebody should commercialize that. Somebody should make it. I'm sure that there's a way to make a business there, but that was the extent of it. I talked to Mike about it. Mike is the project leader of Homebrew and my co-founder. We spent, time going back and forth, and then we kind of never did anything with it. Fast forward to 2019 when I left GitHub. I didn't intend to start a company, but what happened was I went on to Twitter and I posted, "Hey, I'm hiring for an apprentice. Come work with me on my side projects. I'll pay you for, a year. And at the end of the year, I'll help you get a job, and we'll use all the latest tech, and it'll be a lot of fun. It'll be low stress." And within about a week of posting that, I had 500 applicants for the job. And that was like some market validation that in 2019, early career software devs had a really hard time getting their first roles, which I don't know that that's actually changed much. And so what I ended up doing was hiring 4 of them and telling them, "Hey, instead of a year, we're going to do this for 3 months." And we basically, the prerequisites were you had to know how to code, whether you were self-taught or you went to a boot camp or you studied in university. And the second kind of requirement was you've never had a job as a software engineer. And so I hired this team, and we basically just taught them everything it is to be a developer by doing things. And we got some, startups involved where we said, "Hey, look, these folks will come to your company, work on, your engineering team, but they'll report to us and they'll have kind of, mentors that look out for them with a goal of transitioning them to full-time roles." And that's how this business started. It had nothing to do with Homebrew or Workbrew. It was a developer apprenticeship program.
Interesting.
And that grew within the first few months to, over $1 million of ARR. And it was going really, really well. but it was not a startup kind of business. It was, a services business, and it was an educational business. And unfortunately, when the pandemic hit, everything we were doing was in person. And so all of our customers essentially churned within a 10-day period. And we had to help everybody get new jobs and move on. And then I went back to the drawing board and I was like, what are we actually doing here? We tried some ideas in the education space, online education. I'm really passionate about developer tools. And I'm also very interested in IoT, Internet of Things.
Yeah.
And so I spent some time working on IoT projects and doing things like building developer tools to make it easier to build your own hardware devices. And then, fast forward a little bit, I was a solo founder. Some former colleagues from GitHub joined me. We became a team of 3. And that's when we kind of got to the point of saying, hey, let's play to our strengths. And our strengths are dev tools, Ruby programming language. My co-founder, Mike, is the project leader of Homebrew. And I reapproached the topic of, hey, we should work on a Homebrew for business.
Yeah.
Our initial idea was that we would be building developer tools. And Homebrew is a developer tool, and it's loved by many developer tools. But we went out and we, went to the market and started to talk to people. And what we found was that large companies have a lot of security and compliance needs related to developer workstations. And so where we ended up going with the idea was building an enterprise-ready version of Homebrew, and ultimately, getting to the point where we are like an enterprise software delivery platform. One central place where you can deploy all the software to all of your devices, and manage it, keep it patched, get vulnerability alerts, set policies, put guardrails in place and things like that. And it's all built on top of this really amazing open source infrastructure, Homebrew, the open source package manager that's in use by, tens of millions of people. And so it kind of happened organically. Like, we didn't set out and say, hey, let's go do this thing. It was more, well, these are our skills. These are things we know about. What do people need related to this? And that's how we finally got to Workbrew, which we really only started working in earnest on in 2023.
Interesting. Yeah. So there's some really cool threads there. One thing I heard is just trying things and not necessarily knowing that they're going to become huge or the next thing, but having a bias for action and just getting started. And you've done that multiple times in your career. And it sounds like around 2023 is when you landed on this idea, which, as you said, play to your strengths. And the other thing I heard was you did a lot of customer interviews. I'm really curious to hear. Actually, maybe we could step back and say, what is Workbrew, just for people who maybe don't have a good idea of Workbrew and versus Homebrew, and how are they different? Maybe we should just level set before I ask my next question. How would you describe Workbrew?
So first, I'll start with Homebrew. So Homebrew is an open source package manager. A package manager is a tool that you use to install software on your device. You can think about it as the number one app store for developers on Mac OS. If you're a software developer and you need Python, or you need OpenSSL, or you need curl, or you need any of 15,000 commonly used packages, Homebrew is the de facto standard. Everybody uses Homebrew. Homebrew is so much of a standard that Apple, when they got up on stage at WWDC and they announced Apple Silicon, almost immediately after they said Apple Silicon's, available, they said Homebrew works on day one. Even Apple knows that Homebrew is super important to the developer ecosystem on their devices. So that's what Homebrew is. Homebrew is also, it's an open source project. It's all volunteers. There's 20, 30 maintainers. There's thousands of contributors. And then Workbrew, I guess the way to talk about Workbrew is to say it's an enterprise-ready, app store for your company. Obviously, we are based on Homebrew, and what that means is that our core competency is around developer tooling. So every single developer-oriented, tool that could use in the enterprise is available via Workbrew, and it works as you would expect. It's fully supported. There are other tools on the market that let you do things like install apps on your machines. I think all of them basically ignore developer tooling entirely. And so we're starting from a point of the developers who are among the strongest drivers in a company's adoption around like being a creative professional are fully supported by Homebrew, and that means they're fully supported by Workbrew. And we're bringing those techniques that people use, as developers to the entire company. So the simple way to think about it is Workbrew is the app store for your company. It's a managed app store where every single, piece of software that's in it is observable by your team. It can be updated by your team. You can put guardrails in place. You can do automations around it. So it's really just a way to manage all the installed software on your Macs. We also run on Linux. We also run on Windows under WSL, but 90% plus of our users are on Mac OS.
Awesome. Yeah, makes complete sense. And the other interesting thing I think about it is sort of the building a business on top of open source, which isn't always intuitive to people. It's like, hey, isn't this open source? Doesn't that mean free?
Mm-hmm.
How do you kind of build a commercial business on top of it? And somebody once shared with me this analogy because it's not that dissimilar in my understanding from like Red Hat, for example, how they built their business and how maybe if like the open source free part is like a lemonade recipe, then what you're providing is the stands for selling that lemonade, where the stands like clean themselves and track how much lemonade was sold and keep the the lemons super fresh, and kind of all of the like ancillary scaffolding around the open source part to make it useful for particularly corporate and enterprise environments. Is that kind of a fair analogy?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I would go a little bit further on the open source versus, commercial angle and say that there are different kinds of open source businesses out there. The first is these companies that use open source as a marketing tactic, where they're not actually doing open source according to like the OSI definition of what open source is. It's more source available type of businesses where they say, hey, we made this thing, we're going to call it open source as a way for people to feel less lock-in, but ultimately buy more of the product. Then there's the next kind of tier, which is more traditional, the model of like open core, where a company creates an open source tool, makes it freely available as an official OSI approved license software that you can do what you want with it, but also sells some kind of additional service, some kind of additional features, hosted version of it. You could say like, maybe a database is a good example. They build an open source database, but then they provide a cloud service where you can subscribe to get instances of the database running. And that's also, a viable option for folks doing open source. But I don't think we fit into either of those categories. And I like to look at examples like GitHub and Tailscale as open source companies that are more similar to how we work. We do not control the Homebrew open source project. Homebrew has actually existed for 16 years. It predates Workbrew. It's well established. Lots of people use it. And we contribute. Many of our employees work on Homebrew. They're either maintainers or part of the leadership committee or otherwise involved. We also support Homebrew financially. We contribute code back to Homebrew. But at the end of the day, Homebrew is a freestanding, independent open source project. And if you look at GitHub, for example, Git is not controlled by GitHub. It's a freestanding open source project that predated GitHub.
Yeah.
Tailscale, similarly, there's an open source project called WireGuard. WireGuard predates Tailscale. It's an open source project to do VPN tunneling. But what they all have in common, including with Workbrew, is that there's an opportunity to add a layer on top of all of that that provides massive business value. So GitHub, what they figured out was this Git thing is really cool. It's really valuable for collaboration, though it's a little bit esoteric and hard to use. What if we built a web interface on top of it that made it really, really easy for developers to collaborate? And we really went from like the stone age of using email-based patches to pull requests, which everybody just takes for granted now. With Tailscale, setting up a WireGuard tunnel includes, going on the terminal, setting up your own keys, having a way to rotate the keys, having to do NAT traversal. If you have double NAT situations, there's all kinds of technical challenges around making those things work. Tailscale says, come and use our product and we'll be the layer on top that basically routes all of this stuff together for you. So we're not actually providing the encryption and the security of the tunnels themselves, but we're doing all of the control. And so that's how I think about Workbrew is, Homebrew is very powerful. And it's also, there's nothing to say against Homebrew from a security perspective. It's just that as you add more and more devices running Homebrew, you have a problem that kind of explodes in complexity with regard to management. And so I think of Workbrew as kind of a control plane for Homebrew. So our first wave of customers are all very familiar with Homebrew, use Homebrew every day with their developers. They adopt Workbrew as a centralized way to manage those installations, get visibility, etc. But then the next generation of customers after the developer driven companies is just companies that have software installed on their devices and they want to keep it up to date. But, on the open source front, I think those are much better comparisons than, the open source as a marketing ploy or, open source as like open core.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes complete sense. I love how you kind of drew those analogies with GitHub and Tailscale. One thing I wanted to ask is how did you get your first 10 customers and how did you get your first revenue? Whenever I talk to entrepreneurs, they have a good idea and they've even got a good early start on a problem, but they really struggle to go to that 0 to 1 where it's like from nothing to something that actually provides value. If you could go back to those early days in 2023, 2024, like how did you get to the part where you actually felt like you had traction, like real traction? This thing has legs.
Yeah. So there's a couple of ways to do this. One is to, make something that's free to use and try to get it in front of people and get them to use it. Another way is to try to sell something from the beginning. And I think both ways can work. My strategy was selling from day one. And so as soon as we had the idea for this, the first thing that we did is we went out and we tried to sell a design partnership. We basically went to all the companies that we could think of that we knew they were using Brew, maybe places where we knew people. We had ex-colleagues from prior companies and whatnot. We say, hey, look, is this a problem for you? What are the real problems with relation to Brew? How can we help you with that? And we tried to sell them essentially pay us a certain amount of money every month, and we'll sit down with you and listen to your feedback, and we'll build bespoke software. That bespoke software, we might give it to other people in the future, but for now, we're just going to try and help you solve your problems. And we did that for 6 to 8 months, while at the same time, we were using all the feedback from the rejection of pitching that to people to inform our product roadmap. What are we going to build first? And over time, we started to have, some features that, solve some problems. One of the early ones was, how do we install Brew on our devices in a scalable way? Like getting people up and running with Brew prior to Workbrew was go to the Homebrew website, grab this command that says curl to bash, run it in your terminal, and you're up and running. Not necessarily the best practice for like a large enterprise with thousands of employees setting up, Homebrew. They'd rather have it all centralized. So we give them an installer, right? And that was, kind of one of the first features that people saw value in. Then once we got past the design partnership stage, it was really, we had a product that we could sell. It was very, very bare bones. Not a lot of people wanted to buy it, but we just sold it and sold it and sold it. And I think the entirety of 2024, I did sales calls every single day, multiple times a day, trying to sell basically vaporware, software that didn't yet exist. We can build that. Like all of the things were like, what do you need to solve? Yeah, we can have that ready. And I had this line that was, I bet I can build that faster than you can buy it. Right.
I like that.
These big companies, a lot of our customers are regulated industries, banks, insurance, government, etc. And they don't move very quickly. And so if they say, we'll definitely be on the hook to buy this thing with whatever functionality, we could very easily say as a small company, we can have that for you in 3 weeks. Sign the contract, and in 3 weeks we'll deliver it before you've completed your security audit, right?
Right, which for them
that's how we
is
got to our first
insanely-
version. Quick,
Which for them
that's
is
very quick
insanely
for them.
fast. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's kind of how that first round went. And then like to get those like first 10 customers, we got our first customer, I would say, this year. We sold our first enterprise deal with a start date of January 1, 2025. So we're 11 months, from then. And now we're in the, double digits of enterprise customers and, hundreds of self-serve, credit card-based customers.
Awesome. So you led with curiosity. You went seeking problems instead of running away from them. And you kind of marketed your superpower, which is building and shipping quickly and then leveraging those. Essentially, you were being paid early on, not in money, but in learnings because you were learning what problems mattered. And that research is not easy to get elsewhere, right? They're kind of in these corporate walled gardens and you need access to busy people and to convince them that you're worth their time to tell you about their problems so that you can actually come up with unique and innovative solutions for them. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, we also had an unfair advantage, right? Like this is one of the, tropes of startup life is like, what's your unfair advantage? Figure it out and then use it. And so our unfair advantage is Homebrew. Homebrew's installed on estimated 35 million devices. So if you go to a company and you say, we already know that you have this open source software installed on hundreds or thousands of devices in your company. Does anybody in your company manage it? Who manages it and what problems they have? Their ears perk up. Yes, this is a huge problem for me. I've been trying to solve this for a long time. Why hasn't this existed before? And so that was the thing that like really, drove our ability to get the feedback and things like that. It wasn't like charm or charisma or anything to say, hey, you should really help me. It was have something people want. They want a solution to these security and compliance problems around their software supply chain.
Totally. That makes sense. If you could, is there one thing that felt like maybe one of the hardest things in going from, your idea, your initial research to, I think you said you got your first big enterprise customer, recently. What in that journey was like the hardest thing? Or if you could go back, would you maybe do it differently? Or like anything along those lines in terms of like
Yeah.
enterprise sales and
I
actually
mean, it's
getting.
funny that you say that, like recently, like 11 months seems like an eternity ago. At that time we were, I don't know, definitely less than half the size we are now, maybe like 5 people. And the number of things that have happened in that time frame are just, it's unbelievable from this perspective. In terms of the hardest things, I would say like learning the enterprise sale process and expectations and how all of that machinery works. As I mentioned, I'm a marketer, right? Like, so I'm a software engineer. Like, it depends on like what hat I'm wearing when you talk to me, but like my default is I'm a software developer, right? Like I love coding. I love computers. I've been doing this, since second grade, I was writing code, right? But my career has always been marketing. And then as a founder, my job is selling, right? Like literally the job of every founder is sell, sell, sell. And what's interesting about this is that it helped me develop an appreciation for, that community-oriented marketing that we were talking about. When I did that for my previous companies, Twilio and GitHub, I never really had KPIs that were monetary. I had KPIs like how many web visitors do we have? How many trial signups do we have? How many, actions did they take in our program or whatever? But it was never ARR. It was never what's the account value of what's your pipeline? How much have you added to your pipeline? And so everything has a different tint to it when you look at it from the angle of you're a founder, your job is selling, and selling into the enterprise. I told you from day one we were selling. Selling into the enterprise is very hard because it's a slow sales cycle. Many of our deals have, many months of process associated with them, not because it's a hard technical rollout, but you need to get budgetary approvals, you need to go through multiple VPs. But the payoff is huge.
Yeah.
7-figure deals, with Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies, when you're solving a very important security problem for them, they don't get signed overnight and you have to learn how to navigate all of that stuff. So I think for me, that's been the most challenging, the hardest thing. We're doing it, but it wasn't natural. And so now I have years of experience of doing that. And it's, taken that much time to get this off the ground, in combination with, 12 months ago, the feature set of the product was pretty different than what it is today. So it's a lot of things happening at once.
Any sales tips that jump to your mind around like here's how to some quick tips for enterprise sales?
So one of the things that we've been doing to some success is enabling our champions with tools to get internal approval. And so one of them that's works really well for us is just the ability to give them something to go back to their manager and say, hey, look, I need to get this done. If we do it within, these parameters, I can get something as a win. And it really doesn't need to be much. It doesn't even need to be like, a dollar value associated with it. But knowing that the way that these things work is there's a requirement internally to make these decisions with like some amount of rigor. So we'll often get asked like, who are your competitors? Should we be like doing a CFP process, especially like in the larger companies that are more regulated? And giving those people who are our champions the tools they need to go back and say, look, I evaluated these 3 other options. Workbrew is the best option because it has the lowest total cost of ownership. Here's how we should move forward, right? Like being able to just arm them with that stuff is very, very valuable and important. And it wasn't immediately obvious, to do that. This is another one I actually would say, as a founder, there's lots of advice that you hear people give over and over again. And what I've learned is that you can hear that advice all day, but until you experience it firsthand, it doesn't sink in the same way. And so, don't kick yourself when you like hear something and you do it a bunch of times and then you were like, oh, I should have done it that way that other people told me. That happens to me, every week, right? Like there's something like, oh, I've heard about this before. We're doing it a little bit differently. And then when you actually run into the issue at hand, it's completely obvious, why it is that way. For example, with like security audits or something, like everybody has to do these security audits, whether you're SOC 2 or whatever. Everybody tells you like what a pain is going to be, but until you go through it a bunch of times, you don't realize, how true it is.
Cool. So that makes a ton of sense about giving them a win. What about the demo? For me, I've really found that showing at least a sneak preview of Risotto early makes people's eyes light up as they kind of witness the art of like what's really possible with AI these days. Do early demos and early sneak previews of the product also help you in the sales cycle? And if so, what do you show? What's that magic wow moment that you can show in 5 or 10 minutes to make people's eyes light up with Workbrew?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the big need that our customers have is around security and compliance. That's, the biggest thing that they come and talk to us about is there's a lot of packages. I don't know what's installed. I don't know what I don't know. Where are these things coming from? And so when we give them a demo and they're asking these questions, we can show them on their own devices, how many packages they have installed that are vulnerable. One of the really nice things about Workbrew is we have a very generous free tier. It's not a free trial. It's unlimited users and devices, the ability to gain visibility into every installed package across your entire fleet. And so oftentimes customers will come to us using the free plan and then ask for more information. And we're able to temporarily turn on all of those additional features during the demo and say, hey, look, you've got, 500 devices. And among those 500 devices, each one of them has, 5 or 6 vulnerabilities. One click, you can patch all of those vulnerabilities. And that's a really, really impactful, value proposition for them. I now know, I've been able to confirm something I only could suspect before, and then I can act on it. And that's really valuable. So that's one of the ones that we use a lot.
When you show them that, is that the first time that they're seeing that data? Like they weren't able to easily even collate the vulnerabilities before that?
I mean, they have some general idea, but there's no real easy way for them to inventory all of the packages installed across their devices and then cross-reference that with all of the vulnerabilities and then report on it. So, if they're using Workbrew on the free tier, they're able to see, for example, there are known vulnerabilities in the fleet. And then once they, turn on, the pilot, for our enterprise, sales serve customers, they see, oh my God, there's so many vulnerabilities. What can I do about it? How should I respond to these things?
Yeah.
So what often happens is, as part of that process, they get access and turn it on for all of their, their first batch of engineers, and they're able to immediately see the value, right? There's nothing, show, don't tell is kind of the thing. I mean, this is maybe going a little bit too far back, but one of the really early things in my career that was very successful was when I was at Twilio, I gave this demo, which was how the Twilio API works. And I wrote this whole talk and I had slides and I was ready to show it. And we had an audience of 700 or 800 people in the room. And the night before, I scrapped the entire demo and basically decided to do a live coding demo of let me use the API and make all the phones in the room ring. And the impact on the audience was so strong. Show, don't tell, right? We can talk about features, we can talk about the way things work, but like if you actually can show them with their own data, their own devices, how this can save them time, make them more secure, that's much more impactful than talking about it.
Yeah, and just being willing to dive into an unscripted moment and show the messiness of a live demo or show the messiness of live coding. And I think that's really powerful too, and shows kind of a bias for action, which is people don't see as much as you might expect. So that makes a ton of sense. Well, awesome. This has been such a really cool conversation. There's really only one big topic that I think we haven't touched on yet. And it's what everybody seems to be talking about all the time now in B2B software, but AI. AI is all over the billboards in the San Francisco Bay Area. It seems like every customer conversation that comes up with us, obviously we're an AI first IT help desk. I'm curious when it comes to Workbrew, do people ask you about AI, and what's your typical response? Like, how are you riding this wave, and how are you improving Workbrew with AI, if at all?
So the first part of this is that our team is very heavy users of AI. So we use AI agents, we use, AI in all different aspects of doing our work. When it comes to our product though, what's interesting is we do get a lot of questions from our customers about AI. But because we're selling them a product that helps them with security and compliance and visibility into things that are, installed on their devices, a lot of times their concerns are about data privacy. They ask us, "Are you using AI? Like, is all of our data getting fed into something?" And we're able to tell them very directly, "No, we don't opt you into any kind of AI training or anything like that." And what we do instead is we give you access to all the APIs. We have kind of some example use cases with some of our customers where they have like AI agents running in Slack where they can, do things against the Workbrew API, but it's something where we're using kind of the layer in between rather than directly on the customer's data. And then the other thing that we're looking at is when it comes to understanding those 15,000 packages in the Homebrew ecosystem, we get a lot of questions about like sensible defaults. People will come in and say, "Hey, like John, we're going to roll out Workbrew. What things should I put limits on or gates or guardrails around? And why would I do that?" And one of the challenges is there's a disconnect between the developer who's on their device using Brew and building things who knows all of these open source packages and the IT administrator who's responsible for making sure that only the trusted stuff gets through and there's some kind of, kind of workflow around approvals and things like that. And so there's definitely an opportunity here to use it as a tool for educating, what is this thing? Why is it important? What trends are we seeing? And so we're exploring more around that. And then another area that comes up a lot among our customers with relation to AI is we want to know what AI tools our team are using. And so within the Homebrew ecosystem, we can actually go and install a ton of different AI. If it's a software package, it's probably available in Homebrew. So we have the ability to give you more visibility into what tools are being used in engineering, in different parts of your company around this. And so that's been something that's been interesting in the AI space for our customers with relation to Workbrew.
Interesting. So it sounds like there's kind of a healthy dose of skepticism in your target buyers around AI, or at least they're not fully convinced of it.
They're all using AI. They're definitely using it and they have a taste for it, but it's just what's the appropriateness of applying AI from our product. And for me, it's really about, one of the biggest things that happens in the sales process for us when customers are evaluating Workbrew is the security evaluation. They come and they look at us and they say, "Hey, is this thing actually going to make us safer? What are your security practices? What are your data privacy practices?" And the thing that I'm able to say fully confidently is that we only collect the absolute minimum amount of data we need to do in the product, to do the things that the product does. And so their concern is really about, hey, how are my engineers, how is that stuff going to get roped into some of these things? And so we're able to just say, "Hey, look, we're not doing any of that." And it's very, very easy to get through those security audits because of that. Now, when it comes to AI functionality, you can implement some of this stuff without, you know, compromising data privacy. For example, you can have bring your own keys, right? So you could have an MCP server. We have, kind of a private beta MCP server for Workbrew where you can say, what vulnerabilities are new this week in my fleet?
Yeah.
Can you give me a summary of what they mean? Right? That kind of stuff is all possible and interesting, but the way that we're approaching it is with a very strict kind of line around what is done with the customer's data and what, tools have access to that.
Yeah. So being thoughtful, being methodical, having clear guardrails, segregation of responsibilities, that all makes complete sense. Amazing. Well, what about maybe just wrapping up on a lightning topic? I think people are always looking for recommendations on maybe things that they might want to check out themselves. What about kind of more on either a personal level or maybe not built into the product, but helping you in your day-to-day work? Are there any AI workflows or tools? Are you a GPT person? Are you a Gemini person? Or is there something else entirely that you've found to be useful when it comes to AI tooling?
I mean, one of the things that it's not directly AI tooling, but I'm a software engineer, so I like things that are code oriented. I actually did a podcast series a while back called the Yes Code Podcast, talking about how developers, building products can expose kind of high level primitives in their product to developers that gets around this no code limitation of we have a bunch of no code tools you can drag and drop, but then you run into a wall.
Yeah.
Anyways, in that vein, I've become a pretty heavy user of a tool called N8N, which is like a workflow builder. But what I love about it is you can drop down to code really easily, and you can integrate with tons and tons of different, other tools. It's kind of like Zapier or if this, then that, but much more of a developer mindset to it. And what I love is that we can use it as kind of a way to build processes within our company as like a company operating system where you can have an easy click and drag and drop use case. You can integrate it with any of the AI tools to run different models or run different workflows or whatever. But then you can also drop down to code. And what's really nice about it is managing the authentication between all these different tools is all kind of done in a single kind of story. Going back to my GitHub days, GitHub was a pioneer in this topic called chat ops. So like you could open up your chat app and type a command and deploy GitHub, to production by typing deploy GitHub, right? This was before Slack existed, right? This was all built internally by a team. And we had this bot called Qbot, which had knowledge of everything around the company, but it was a giant spaghetti of code that there were lots and lots of problems with it in terms of maintainability and so on and so forth. And I feel like N8N gives us a lot of that without, having just one giant code base where everything is all mixed together. Anybody in the company can contribute to it. So, definitely something worth checking out.
Yeah, cool. No, I've heard great things about N8N, and us being in the IT space, it definitely pops up. I'm maybe dating myself, but do you remember a chat tool called HipChat?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Did you guys use that at anywhere you used to work, or?
So we never used it, but fun fact, one of the co-founders was in my Java class in college. So I kind of go way back into those days.
Yeah. I'm going way back when I was doing some software engineering at HelloSign back in circa, 2014, 2015. We were HipChat. This was before we moved over to Slack. And that was my first exposure to chat ops. And I remember that the DevOps team was big into it because it drove transparency. You could not only have the convenience of executing a command and having it do things like, say, a deploy, like pushing a cloud deploy to a production or staging, and you could give the flags and the parameters, but everybody could see what you're doing. So it's almost like a community command line that people can see, and you see the output as well. So it kind of brings observability into the mix for the whole team, and it's great for like incidents. And I kind of think that these were the kernels of like how, modern day incident response and swarming in chat has kind of evolved because people saw a lot of benefits to this collaborative language-based approach to running and issuing commands. So I totally agree that we're riding that same wave at Risotto. So it's really interesting to see AI being thrown into the mix as well because it's so good with natural language, as we've all seen.
Yeah.
Well, incredible. It's such an awesome conversation, John. Thank you so much for your time. And last quick thing as we're wrapping up, but if people want to learn more about Workbrew, they want to learn more about the free tier you talked about, just get their feet wet, what's like the best way for them to get started?
Yeah, just head to workbrew.com. You can sign up. It's totally free to get started. You can add all your devices and get visibility into what's going on. And if you want more information on workbrew.com/demo, you can just go grab a time with our team and we'd be happy to chat with you and help you figure out how to get up and running.
Awesome. Sounds good. Well, so great to talk to you. Thanks again, John, and we'll see you around.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.